anywhere. Call it what you will, the Minnesota State Fair is one of our oldest and most venerable institutions. For 5 generations, Minnesotans have taken part in this annual celebration. Part livestock exhibition, part commercial display,
Instant tomato juice.
and part carnival midway. The fair has almost as many facets as it has exhibitors and visitors. For some, it's the just reward for a season's hard work. For others, it means the end of summer and freedom. One last celebration before winter descends. Whatever their reasons, Minnesotans love to boast about their fair. While we can no longer claim ours is the biggest, many say it's still the best. Fair boosters point to the well-groomed grounds, charming architecture, and abundance of trees as a few of the features that make Minnesota's the fairest of the fairs.
What's her name? Her name's Lily.
But more important than appearances, the Minnesota State Fair has stayed true to its agricultural roots. It's still a real live harvest fair, organized and run by an agricultural society. It's this authenticity that distinguishes it from other fairs. The unique character of the fair is the product of a tradition that dates back some 150 years. It's hard to say exactly when the Minnesota State Fair first started, but as early as 1850, well before Minnesota became a state, agricultural fairs were being organized in Minnesota. By 1854, the agricultural fair had become an annual institution in what was still a sparsely populated frontier territory. That time, there were fewer than 10,000 white settlers trying to eke out a living in the harsh climate of Minnesota.
The early economy of Minnesota was a kind of touch-and-go thing. Why, in a struggling community that's barely keeping its head above water, or maybe I should say above ice, is there this drive for fairs? They're not simply a matter of agriculture, although agriculture was one of the reasons they were held. If you go back and look at the record of who were the great instigators, the creators of fairs, by and large, they tend to be lawyers and business community leaders, not necessarily farmers.
If the fledgling territory of Minnesota was to grow and prosper, it would need to increase its population by attracting new immigrants. Business leaders seized on the idea of a territory-wide agricultural fair as a means to this end.
One of the early innovations in Minnesota agriculture was the large-scale cultivation of wheat on the flat, fertile prairie lands south of the Twin Cities. And the fair became an instrument of marketing the availability of that kind of land. It was customary for merchants, for sellers of agricultural goods, for potential investors to go from fair to fair and look around. And the state fair itself served those very same ends. So if Minnesota could prove through making little palaces out of shocks of wheat, for example, or making scale models of Fort Snelling out of apples, they would then have proven to the outside world that this was a great place to settle, that in fact this was not a frozen wilderness. Pictures of such items at the Minnesota State Fair were often used in immigrant literature, sent to Sweden and to Norway and to Germany to try to encourage people to come to this great and wonderful new place on the face of the earth.
Although opinions vary, Purists call the fair of 1860 the first official fair on record. Coming just 3 years after statehood, it was held at Fort Snelling and was the first fair sponsored by the newly organized Minnesota State Agricultural Society. Created by state law in 1859, the society still governs the fair today.
When the Minnesota State Fair was held out at Fort Snelling, the sort of definitive physical form of a fairground took shape. First of all, there was a perimeter fence. That was to keep out people who hadn't paid admission. The second ingredient was always a racing oval, and we've got one here today, right below the grandstand. In the middle of that racing oval, you might show animals, or you might use the racing oval to parade prize pigs and cows around in a circle and look at them. Or you might use it to have trials of speed. And in the grandstand section, those bleachers that were always built next to the racing oval, there was an opportunity to see shows.
By the 1870s, the fair's importance as an educational institution was beginning to be recognized. In keeping with this mission, the fair's organizers sought to reach the widest possible audience. In an era when long-distance travel was arduous and slow, this meant taking the fair to the people.
In the 1870s and early 80s, we had what was called in Minnesota the Fair on Wheels. It traveled to the farmer.
The first state fairs were held at a variety of locations around the state, including Fort Snelling and Owatonna, Red Wing, Rochester, but it became clear as time went by that the fair, if it was to grow and be as big as it could, would have to be in somewhere in the Twin Cities. Civic groups were appointed to debate where a good location would be, and of course they couldn't agree on anything. The St. Paul group decided to locate the fair near what's now University and Fairview Avenues, and the Minneapolis group decided that Minnehaha Park by Minnehaha Falls would be an excellent place for fairgrounds, and as long as they're bringing the fairgrounds over, why not bring all the state office buildings in the capital as well? Well, that didn't go over real big. While all of this intrigue was going on, the Ramsey County Board of Commissioners, who operated a poor farm midway between the downtowns, they decided to donate this property. The Ag Society said, yeah, that's wonderful, why not? And the fairgrounds have been here ever since. That's 1885.
Getting to the fair was a big production number in the 19th century. You go off to this strange place where you don't even know if you're going to have a roof over your head. That was always a big issue. Where did a farmer stay? Very early on, the fair created a white city, what it called the Farmer's Village, that survives today as a kind of auto park right inside the fairgrounds, so that people could come and rent a tent for 25 cents a night and stay with the whole family. One of the tensions that developed in the state fair after it moved to Minneapolis and St. Paul was exactly that, a tension between the slowness and the naturalness of a typical day in the life of rural Minnesota and a clock watcher's life in the Twin Cities. At 4 o'clock or 4:30 or 5 o'clock, suddenly a manic amount of activity happened at the fairgrounds because mechanics, as they were called, or shop girls, got off work and got on the trolleys and went streaming to the Minnesota State Fair in search of a whole different life from a life of animals and hay and grooming and getting ready for a competition. They were looking for some action. They were looking for a little hot music, a chance to wink at a pretty girl.
Tuesday morning, 11 a.m., it's showtime at the State Fair Band Show.
Thank you very much, and good morning, and howdy.
For those country fans who couldn't get tickets to Garth Brooks' sold-out Grandstand show, this is another chance to hear a national country act.
Anybody here like country music? Oh, you in your right place. Now the morning sun.
And this show is free of charge. As is this show. Just 2 of the more than 60 free shows offered daily on the fairgrounds. The fair works hard to keep pace with the tastes of today's audiences. In an era of information overload, most Americans tend to take their entertainment for granted. But there was a time when the fair was the only window on the wider world for rural Minnesotans.
This is one of the larger areas in the museum, and we have an area for rodeo, for circus equipment and costumes and so forth. Over here we have a searchlight that they use at the top of the grandstand to show the acts and so forth. And here
Gail Frost runs a small museum devoted to the history of entertainment at the fair. It's located on the northwest corner of the fairgrounds in Heritage Square. The artifacts and memorabilia on display here reflect Frost's lifelong association with the show business side of fair life.
My dad had the concession in the grandstand in 1909, and I came around, born in 1913, and started hanging around about 1920. You know, a kid, 7, 8 years old, can sweep and make himself useful. And this is wonderful. You know, you can have fun when you're a little kid.
Frost Museum tells the story of a show business tradition that's older than motion pictures, a tradition that predates vaudeville by 20 years.
In the 19th century and the early 20th century, how little entertainment there was in the lives of most Americans, how isolated most Minnesotans were in small communities or on farms, and how important it was for them to come to the fair and hear an orchestra, hear somebody making music or singing, or see somebody doing something remarkable like dressing up in an elephant suit and walking across a high wire. So entertainment comes in right from the beginning. Cassius Clay, who was one of the most famous orators of his day, was brought to Minnesota, for example, to give a speech in the 1860s at a fair, and thousands upon thousands of people turned up to hear him. I don't know that most of us would turn out to hear a speech if someone paid us, but it's an important part of 19th century entertainment.
Of the fair's many famous orators, few were more colorful than Theodore Roosevelt. Old Bull Moose appeared at the fair on 3 separate occasions in the early 1900s. He first spoke at the fair in 1901, while serving as vice president of the McKinley administration. The speech contained the now famous line, made in reference to Latin American diplomacy, that the U.S. ought to walk softly and carry a big stick. Barely 4 days after speaking at the fair, McKinley was assassinated, and Roosevelt was sworn in as president. What Roosevelt had intended as a routine political speech was now seized on by the press as a definitive statement of his political beliefs. Dubbed the Minnesota speech, it was widely quoted and analyzed. The fair continued to make headlines around the turn of the century as a locally owned pacing horse named Dan Patch started tearing out the record book. The champion steed ran his fastest race during a state fair trial heat in 1906. Running before a grandstand crowd of 93,000, he ran the mile-long course in the world record time of 1 minute 55 seconds. The feat attracted international attention and further enhanced the fair's reputation as a world-class event. The same racing oval and grandstand bleachers that were used for horse races later served as an outdoor theater for the staging of pageants and nighttime spectacles.
These were shows that had sound, light, pathos, girls in diaphanous dresses, everything you ever wanted. They would choose a theme, usually one that was horrendous in some way, like the last days of Pompeii, for example. Then crews would go out and set up little cardboard buildings to look like Pompeii all over the interior of the Grandstand Oval. When the lights went down and nighttime came, the grandstands would be packed, and lights would appear suddenly within these little cardboard houses, and you would hear the voice of an announcer bellowing at you, and they sinned mightily in those days, and they were smote. And suddenly, this tremendous eruption of fireworks from a cardboard mountain. Kaboom, kaboom. Spotlights, cardboard houses would suddenly catch fire. More and more kabooms, until finally Pompeii would be brought to its knees.
By the 1930s, the night grandstand shows featured Busby Berkeley-style extravaganzas, glitzy musical variety productions that featured sophisticated animal acts, song and dance men, and always plenty of chorus girls. The finale, inevitably, would include fireworks. The daytime shows of the period offered entertainment of the kitchen sink variety. The main attraction was often an automobile race. But the auto races of this era were very different from today's sport.
They'd have maybe like a 10-mile automobile race on the dirt track, then the drivers would have to get the cars ready. So they'd have a vaudeville act or a high pole act or some act in between the running of the races. Then the drivers would get their cars out and be all ready when that act was through, then they'd have another race. And to me, that's the way to run auto racing. Now they just go round and round and round and they don't do much between.
On this typical day in 1939, the in-between acts also included circus elephants, a dancing bear, the Albert Lee High School Marching Band, and a balloon ascension. But for sheer excitement in the 20s and 30s, nothing could quite compare with Thrill Day.
Thrill Day was a staged accident. Either a little airplane came swooping down out of the sky and flew right through what appeared to be a house, but was really a house made out of paper. Or in one famous incident, old railroad engines were bought and crashed into one another directly in the middle of the grandstand.
The most famous of the head-on locomotive collisions happened at the height of the Depression in 1933. One of the locomotives was christened Old Man Depression, the other NRA, named after the National Recovery Act, a then popular New Deal program.
There's an undercurrent of violence that runs through these shows that culminates in the depths of the Great Depression. So much of life was out of control when you didn't seem to have any handle on what was happening to your farm or your business or your job. One convenient scapegoat was the machine. So I take the thrill shows of the 30s as important indicators of people's feelings of powerlessness and fighting back against them. Grandstand shows changed a whole lot around the time of the Second World War. Charlie McCarthy and Edgar Bergen came to the Minnesota State Fair in 1941, and they were one of the first acts that showed up here in Minnesota who everybody knew about before they got here. They were already celebrities from the radio. What the appearance of Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy signifies is the beginnings of a homogeneous American mass culture that comes at you from electronic media. Thereafter, it seems to me, the Grandstand shows got to be whoever was the current hot national act, whoever had a hot record. Whoever you saw a lot on television.
When John Henry was a little baby, sitting on his daddy's knee, he picked up a hammer and a little piece of steel and said, just little baby, he that is ridiculous.
That's a big change, away from a sort of special fair entertainment to the fair as a part of the broader culture. And I think the importance of that kind of entertainment has diminished over the years. We can get it on television. We can get it through other sources. And it doesn't occupy anything like the central position that entertainment spectaculars fulfilled in the lives of people who really had very little entertainment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Here, singing City Lights, is our first contestant, Julie Gustafson.
Those city lights, those marvelous city lights, those twinkling city lights, luring on.
While entertainment in general has lost some of its appeal for modern audiences, there is at least one form of fair entertainment that continues to delight and surprise even the most jaded audience members.
You have two choices at night for stage entertainment. You can go to the Grandstand and see Garth Brooks or Bob Hope, or you can come to the Miller Beer Bandshell and watch the talent show semifinals. And I would, I just wouldn't bother going to the Grandstand because the real entertainment is at the bandshell. Just a phenomenal array of tap dancing and singing, and if you ever wondered where all the tap dancers have gone, they're here. I mean, tap dancing is alive and well in America. For about 8 or 9 days in a row, they do 50 acts, they audition 50 acts a day, and at least 30% of them had to be dancing. I was astonished. There's a very devoted audience for this, and people come out to the fair, especially on Labor Day for the finals. I think the bandshell seats about 3,000 or 4,000, and you have to get here 2 hours early if you want to get a seat, or else it's standing room only.
We found that there are people that come here night after night after night that are related to no one on the stage, but they just love to come and watch the talent
They do.
contest.
They've come up and given us their opinions as well.
Yes.
That's just what we thought.
Very strongly.
Extremely forward.
And
some would say.
question your decisions.
I can't exactly describe what's so enjoyable about it, but there's just something so unexpected, and maybe it's, you know, part of the stereotypical Minnesota reserve that is totally not in evidence at the talent show. It's phenomenal. It's a pageant of excitement.
Ask any modern fairgoer what they like most about the fair, and the response is predictable.
What are you always sure to do every year at the fair? What do you not miss? Eat. What? Eat. Eat. Okay.
Gyros.
What is it that keeps you coming back?
Everything.
Everything. The food. Food. What kind of food things do you like to get?
Everything. Everything. Hot dogs. Corn dogs. Hamburgers. French fries. Donuts. Turkey.
The Great Minnesota Get-Together has become synonymous in some fairgoers' minds with the Great Minnesota Pig Out.
I've eaten at the fair, man, across the whole state fair, man, Midway and the Grandstand, up on Machinery Hill, man, shoveled in all I can, eaten at the fair.
More than 200 separate food items are sold here. Everything from tabbouleh sandwiches and Italian French fries to root beer-flavored milk and French fried ice cream.
Rice Krispie bars, hot dogs, foot longs, mile longs, piranha putt, horse knockwurst, Polish nuts, turkey dogs, turkey burgers, cheeseburgers, tuna salad, chicken tag, whole wheat, gyros, corny dogs, calzone, pox pots, cheese sandwich, flatbread, fresh banana, peanut butter, whole wheat sandwiches, wontons, egg rolls, green stall.
There are those who simply can't get enough fair food. The author of this little ditty, folk singer Peter Ostrusko, is one of them. His fondness for a particular state fair delicacy borders on obsession.
Is that what keeps you coming back, the food?
Yeah, I was just talking with my friend saying, there's only one reason to come to the fair, is that to come and get corn dogs. And I'll come 4 or 5 times a year. I think about it all year long. I'll think about coming to the fair and having the first corn dog. And then once I'm here and I have it, it's kind of disappointing, after a year long of hibernating, thinking about corn dogs. But, 4 months from now, I'll find myself sitting thinking about corn dogs. Gotta come.
Okay, who's first? We're open for business. Breakfast at Epiphany Country Diner.
For those tired of finger food, there are other fair venues that offer a more substantial cuisine.
Turkey and dressing. Good selection. Let me just circle that for you.
There you go.
Good. 1 and 2 or 3.
Places like the Epiphany Country Dining Hall still serve full sit-down meals. This kind of food has been a part of the fair since the very beginning, when families stayed for weeks and lived according to the rhythms of rural life.
All the churches of Minneapolis, St. Paul set up dining halls early on in tents. We still have remnants of those hanging around, in which you could replicate a country dinner, a big, hot, heavy midday meal, so that you could go out and thresh till you dropped. Around 1893 or so, a new kind of restaurant began appearing at the margins of the Minnesota State Fair called grab joints. And what a grab joint meant was a sort of primitive version of fast food, something you could pick up and walk around and eat with in your hand. And new foods arise to fill that need. The hot dog, or Frankfurter on a bun, comes in. The hamburger, the Hamburg steak. I can't describe how radical this is as a change in American eating habits which up to this point had been extremely formal. You will not leave the table until your dinner is finished. Suddenly, this new fast-paced modern world of city people demands that you eat on the run. It changed America's dietary habits. The notion that you could eat when you wanted to by yourself, and that you could eat on the run. That's a change from the rhythms of nature to the rhythms of the clock. It's also a change from a sort of familial structure to personal independence. The foods that people eat at the fair are interesting, but maybe more interesting are the foods they can't eat but want to. And that is the beautiful ones that are displayed in cabinets in the so-called women's building at the fair.
Kelly, look at the one with the mint. Doesn't that look good?
Well, third place pretty good.
I know it. It's beautiful. Don't you wish you could just jump in there and eat them? We can't. I wish we could.
For generations, fairgoers have feasted their eyes on the tantalizing array of baked goods and other foodstuffs on display at the Creative Activities Building. Once called the Women's Building, the food and crafts displayed here are a quintessential part of any state fair. On the day before the fair, a line forms outside the Creative Activities Building as contestants hustle trays of home-baked goodies up to the registration table. Veterans time their arrival to be just in time to gain an edge in freshness over the competition.
I drove 46 miles. That's why some of them look kind of tough, because they were riding in the back of a car on real bumpy roads to get here.
I don't know what I did with my recipe card for that one. I can't seem to find it. Why don't you? The recipe card for that.
Do you enter every year?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
How many entries this year?
14 in baking and 56 in canning.
That's incredible. How many hours do you estimate that you put into this project?
Well, it's been nonstop from Friday morning all the way through until this morning.
In an era of fast food and microwave entrees, these picture-perfect pies and cakes evoke the past as strongly as any old photograph or scratchy 78.
Women were economically and socially terribly important players in the 19th century farm and city as preparers of food. And the fair honored them in many ways, and one of them was by making their activities central to what the fair was all about. To honor women's handiwork in this way as economically viable and interesting as anything their husbands were doing is, I think, one of the more interesting features of the fair. And it's also interesting to look at changes in what those foods are over the course of time and continuities.
Okay. Now, which one is the next one?
This one is the egg white cake. The angel food is right over there.
White with egg white?
Right, exactly.
400. 400?
Mm-hmm. One of the continuities is what we would call today, I think, ornamental cooking. The notion that food, like prize pigs, has an aesthetic property, that it's important to have something lovely in your life. So that accounts for the interest in the tallest cake, the most beautifully decorated cake, the prettiest pie. And that's still a key part on the scoring sheet of how you get points at the Minnesota State Fair.
This one has a beautiful appearing crust that looks like the All-American pie. It's perfect fluting around the edges, and the crust is not flaky, but it's not broken. It's very even lattice work.
Oh, the lattice work is gorgeous.
To some, this is nothing more than a fattening dessert. But to the true aficionado, like Ann Dimmock, the Blue Ribbon State Fair pie is a thing of beauty.
Oh, that's very good.
What's that one?
That's third place winner. That's a real cherry. Mmm. I might have put that one up ahead of the other one.
Dimmock is a freelance writer. She pens a monthly column called Humble Pie for her community newspaper.
Well, pie is something it's very special. It's very nurturing. You don't find good pie anymore. A lot of women don't make pies, but those that do are sort of keeping alive almost a forgotten craft.
Like the philosopher Emerson, who saw the whole world in a single blade of grass, Dimmock sees pie as a metaphor for something larger.
I grew up in a family that made pies all the time, and we made, about 100 pies every year. And my mother used to take those pies and she'd bring them to people who had sickness in their families, to funerals, people who had a new baby or something. It was an offering of themselves. And I think there's a spirituality in there. How old were you when you learned to make pies?
9 years old.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
My mother was diabetic, so she didn't make them.
She didn't make them, but
I
you
had to
did.
learn how. Yeah.
In addition to its spiritual dimension, Dimmock also considers the politics of pie.
I sort of see pie making as an extension of my feminism, my brand of feminism. It's something that women do. It's a feminine value. Not to be confused with a female value, but because I think all of us are capable of doing these things. It's just that women do it much more often, seems to come more naturally to them.
Okay, then that goes on the cake, and you know where the cake is at. Good. Then I won't worry about it. Bye-bye now.
One of the things that's always impressed me is how enormously great the aesthetic component of fairs is. And that visual component has remained extremely strong up to this day in the State Fair. That's what the bright lights on the Midway are all about. It's about that sense that this is a place where there's something extraordinary to look at. The midway is a kind of interesting term. It suggests that it's midway between something and something else.
All right, pick it out, guy, whatever you like.
Physically, the midway at the Minnesota State Fair has hardly ever been that, but it's a term that's carried over from other venues.
There goes the winner, 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 winner!
In the early days, there were fortune tellers, or there were hoochie-coochie dancers, babies in incubators, 2- and 3-headed animals of one sort or another, or there were contortionists. These amusements often took the form of people doing something or another with their bodies in little booths, and you would pay a fee to go in and see what they would do. In the 1890s, that situation began to change, and it began to change because of innovations in machinery. A man named George Washington Ferris invented a giant steel wheel in which you sat and went to the height of a 10-story building and spun around in the air. I think the Ferris wheel is one of the single most important things that ever happened in the United States in some ways, because it familiarized people. It made an icon, a symbol, out of technology. The Ferris wheel opened the world to the possibility of going at dizzying speeds, even up in the air. It opened up the possibility of airplanes. It opened up all kinds of wild physical experiences for people who'd been used to being flat on the ground. The Minnesota Fair keeps us in touch with the natural world. It's pigs, it's manure, not the latest carnival rides that keep folks coming back year after year. In the earliest state fairs we know about, people brought animals to be judged. They brought cows and pigs, primarily. And we know the kind of criteria they used to evaluate these animals. And it was largely size. And that has a whole lot to do with boosterism. That has a whole lot to do with the proof that this is a fit place to raise an animal. So that if you could produce a pig that would render down to 42 barrels of lard, you had really done something terrific. Pigs that yielded a lot of lard would not strike the modern appetite as great pigs, because we're interested in lean bacon. We're interested in a pork chop without an ounce of fat on it. But a considerable portion of the 19th century diet came from pig fat, the energy food. People ate pie for breakfast. It kept a person warm in the wintertime. Lard for pie crust was probably one of the one or two most important products I can think of in the 19th century. The same set of standards, I might add, was applied to vegetables. It was always the freak vegetables that took the prize. It was always the pumpkin as big as your mother-in-law. It was the squash a quarter of a section long.
Did you see the size? 377 pounds. That's more than Dad weighs.
Freaks of the vegetable variety are still a popular attraction at the modern fair. The giant pumpkins on display at the Ag Hort building are always a surefire crowd pleaser.
You think those pumpkins are big? Look at these lima beans.
These are lima beans, whole lima beans, silver dollar size.
What's your secret?
I have good ground, and I fertilize them maybe 3 times a year, and they'll grow right up to Thanksgiving.
These days, sheer size and size alone may earn you bragging rights, but it's no guarantee that you'll bring home a blue ribbon.
What we're looking for now when we look at prize crops is standardization. We're looking for tomatoes that are all exactly the same size so that they're useful in canning, let's say.
The judging standard that placed a premium on size above all else lasted until the 1890s. But as Minnesota approached the turn of the century, new ideas about farming began to take hold.
That standard rapidly changes in the 1890s when scientific agriculture is introduced into the Midwest. Lots of people come out from the East Coast with fancy Dan agricultural college ideas and begin to say that what you should really be interested in is the improvement of the breed, the efficiency of an animal to do the particular task assigned to it in the grand scheme of things. Now, if you were a backcountry farmer and your whole standard of being as a farmer had been to breed the biggest possible pig in the universe, this was a very new idea.
Along with new ideas about animal breeding, scientific agriculture also introduced Minnesota farmers to the concept of diversification, an important innovation for the state's rural economy.
A man named Orrin Gregg, who had been farming in Vermont, came out to Minnesota and said, look, it would be terrific if in addition to all your wheat planting, you guys thought about a dairy industry. But any old cow won't do for that purpose. You need a cow that's bred for milking.
Second over third because of mammary system. Tighter in the fore, more cleavage, cheeks pointing into the center of the udder in a little nicer sort of way. Also nicer on the hind leg and the set to the hind leg. Your cow's a little cleaner and dairier, no doubt about that.
It suddenly became important in the competitions that had always been happening at the fair to turn away from just give the prize to the biggest one we've got here and to start thinking about things that are very mysterious to city dwellers today when they go to see animal judging and the judge starts saying, I like that udder attachment over there. What the judge is really talking about is this cow physically put together in such a way that she can sustain milking over a long period of time.
I'd like to change anything on the cow. I'd like to clean her up some in the hock and the set to that hock. Not quite as desirable in that hind leg structure and the way she carries it compared to the other parts of her skeleton frame.
If we could use the Olympics and human beings as an analogy, in the dairy cattle circles, I'm looking for the structure that would be a track star, not a wrestler. I want them long, tall, thin, angular. To us in the dairy cattle business, that spells dollar and cents. Those kind of cattle will outproduce and make us more money.
It's the bottom line, it's milk production that you're...
It's paying the bills. And when we get to the point where showing comes ahead of paying the bills, then pretty soon the bankers got our farm and we're doing other things.
Paying the bills has become an increasingly difficult task for many American farmers. Of the many agricultural aspects of the fair, none is more closely linked with the fortunes of farmers than Machinery Hill.
Machinery Hill was our first stop. Arrayed across its 80 acres are the implements of raw power and efficiency which help make American agriculture, Minnesota agriculture, what they are today, the most efficient and productive in the world.
Machinery Hill is one of the oldest parts of the fair, and it reminds us that Minnesota was not only an agricultural state, but also a center for the manufacture of agricultural implements. Silos, for example, are introduced on Machinery Hill for the first time. It was the largest standing display of farm machinery in the world for 5 or 6 generations. People came from as far away as the Soviet Union to look at machinery in action on the hill.
You got to load them up or have a cart to get them down
Well, that's
the road?
what I had a customer that bought 2 of these, and they said it must have saved them at least a day or 2 just in transport alone during this.
But times have changed on Machinery Hill. After farmers, those hardest hit by the farm recession of the 1980s were the makers and the dealers of farm implements.
I see an industry that's gotten very trimmed down and consolidated. I mean, you used to see a lot more brands up there than you see now, and all these great old names like Alice Chalmers and Minneapolis Moline and International Harvester are nowhere to be found. You see more lawn tractors and snowblowers up there now than you see tractors. The combines now have air conditioning, climate control, CD players, and they cost $150,000.
60 years ago, you could send your children to college on the strength of 10 good Holstein or Guernsey cows. You put a lot of labor into it. Now agriculture is great volume and very, very low profit per unit. And that being the case, this person who's got 20 sows or milking 30 cows or what have you, he just doesn't have enough volume to make a good living.
As farming becomes an increasingly industrialized process, it means bigger farms and fewer farmers. Some are wondering what this brave new world of agriculture will mean to the state fair.
The question that I have, and there's no answer to it except to watch and see, is what will happen 10, 20, 30 years from now as Minnesota and the country, the rural part of America, becomes more and more sparsely populated. What will happen then to the fair? Will it ultimately become pure entertainment?
As farming becomes more corporate and less individual, yeah, we'll have to change to reflect that. We'll have to adapt to that. In a lot of senses, the fair doesn't set the agenda, but rather reacts to what's going on out there.
When you go to the fair through a course of your lifetime, you tend to see it as a sign of fixed values, that the sheep are always here, that the corn is always there, and nothing ever changes. But beneath the surface, things are changing all the time. Very small things and very big ones. The change from $2 million agricultural equipment to a backhoe you can use in your own yard. I don't see that as a sign of the decline of the Minnesota State Fair. I see that as a sign of the continual adaptability of the Minnesota State Fair to the needs of this state. It's always been an extremely supple instrument reflecting the character and nature of Minnesotans. It started off with fat pigs, but it gave those up the minute another kind of pig became more viable. It started off with the biggest pumpkin in the world, but it learned that the genetic breeding of uniform corn is probably a better thing. And it's going to learn whatever the 21st century has to teach us.
It's big-time entertainment with big stars and even bigger dance numbers with the movie musical Babes in Arms, followed by the best hoofers in the movie biz on That's Dancing, Saturday night starting at 7 on The Big Show.